She heard her father's voice before she heard the door. He was speaking to someone in the front parlor, a low and urgent murmur that was nothing like his usual relaxed evening tone. Alara handed her coat to the housemaid without looking away from the hallway and walked directly toward the sound. She stopped in the doorway. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, was standing near the fireplace with the posture of a man who had been trying to appear calm for some time and was no longer managing it. Across from him, seated in the armchair that nobody usually sat in because it faced the window at the wrong angle for the afternoon light, was Edmund Hartwell, the Duke of Ashford. He had not been invited. The Duke rose when she entered, which was the correct thing to do, and the fact that he did the correct thing when she was busy being startled and therefore unable to immediately find fault with him was itself irritating. "Lady Whitmore," he said. "Your Grace." She looked at her father. Father. Gerald Whitmore had the look of a man who wished he were somewhere else. He was 61 years old, with thinning gray hair and kind eyes that had spent too long looking worried, and Alara loved him the way you love someone whose weaknesses have become so familiar that they have become part of the landscape of your affection for them. "His Grace came to call," her father said, in the helpless tone of a man announcing weather. "I see that," Alara said. She sat down on the sofa across from the Duke's chair, folded her hands, and looked at him. If he was going to come to her house uninvited, he could at least have the courtesy of explaining himself while she watched. He did. He explained it clearly, without preamble, in the flat and direct way he had of saying things that she had begun to recognize as his actual manner, as distinct from the polished performance he gave at balls and committees. He said he had become aware, over the past year, that Lord Whitmore had accrued certain debts that had since changed hands through a private financial arrangement. He said he was the current holder of those obligations. He said he was not there to discuss the amount or the terms of repayment. Alara kept her face very still. Her father had gone slightly pale. The Duke continued. He said he had a proposal. He would consider the matter closed and the debts dissolved if Lord Whitmore and Lady Whitmore would agree to a social arrangement of mutual benefit. A visible alliance between the Whitmore family and Ashford House for the remainder of the season. Shared attendance at certain events. Dinner once a fortnight at one household or the other. Nothing that would require unusual effort or false warmth. He said it in the voice of a man proposing an amendment to a contract. Her father exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath since before she arrived. Alara said, "Why?" The Duke looked at her. "You heard the question," she said. "I would like to understand the reason. The debts are yours to collect or forgive as you choose. You need nothing from our family socially. We are comfortable, but we are not well connected enough to advance your position in any meaningful way. So I would like to understand why this arrangement is, as you said, of mutual benefit." There was a pause. He said, "There are certain parties who have been watching Ashford House with considerable interest this season. An alliance with a family of your standing and character would be useful in discouraging assumptions I find inconvenient." Alara studied him. "Which assumptions?" He met her eyes. "That I am available." The room was very quiet. She understood then. There was some pressure being applied to him about his unmarried status, and he wanted a visible social connection that would create a degree of ambiguity without requiring actual commitment. She was to serve, essentially, as a social shield. She found this neither flattering nor insulting. It was simply practical, and that, perversely, was the thing that bothered her most about it. "You could have simply told my father this," she said. "You did not need to wait for me to come home." "No," he said. "But the arrangement concerns you more directly, and I thought you deserved to hear it from me, rather than from a second-hand account." Another unexpected thing. She looked at her father, who was trying very hard not to look hopeful in a way that would embarrass them both. She looked back at the Duke. "1 term," she said. "Through the end of the summer season only. We attend the required events together. We are civil. When the season ends, the arrangement concludes quietly, and the matter of the debts is considered settled in full." "Agreed," he said. "And you will not use this arrangement to express any opinion about how I conduct my affairs, including the school." He looked at her for a moment. "I would not dream of it," he said. She could not tell if this was sincere or dry or both. She decided to accept it at face value and address any breach if and when it occurred. "Then we have an agreement," she said. He nodded, rose, thanked her father for his time, and left. The moment the front door closed, her father sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Alara," he said. "Not now, father. I should have told you." "You should have. We will discuss that later." She stood and went to the window. Outside, the Duke's carriage was pulling away from the curb. She watched it until it turned the corner. "How long have you known the debts were his?" "Only this evening. I thought the original creditors had simply... I thought they were still..." "Yes." She knew. He had been hoping the problem was still manageable, still the size it had been when it started. That was how her father operated. He was a warm and generous man who dealt with difficulty by looking slightly to the left of it until it became unavoidable. She had spent most of her adult life being the person who dealt with the things he could not look at directly. "Is it very bad?" she asked. "Not as bad as it could have been," he said. "Thanks to his offer tonight." She nodded. That night, lying awake in the darkness, she went through the conversation again with the methodical patience she applied to problems. She examined each piece of it. He had come in person. He had waited for her to arrive, rather than simply reaching an agreement with her father and leaving. He had given her the choice. He had said she deserved to hear it from him directly. He had also called the arrangement mutually beneficial, and his side of that benefit was the use of her presence to deflect unwanted attention. She was clear-eyed enough to see the transaction for what it was. And yet, she thought about the committee room, about 61 names in a ledger, about a letter from the committee secretary, arriving on a Thursday morning, with news of an anonymous donation. £200. No name attached. No conditions. No expectation of acknowledgement. She had not known for certain it was him, but she had known. She turned onto her side in the dark and told herself to sleep. She decided she would treat the arrangement the way she treated most things she could not immediately resolve. She would observe, she would wait, she would not allow herself to be surprised by anything, and she would see. Over the following weeks, the arrangement began. It was, as he had promised, not difficult. They appeared at the same dinners. They spoke, when addressed together. He was never late, never careless, never anything other than exactly what the situation required. She gave him the same in return. What she had not anticipated was that he was interesting. She had expected stiffness. She had expected the kind of conversation that men of his position usually offered at dinner tables, commentary on politics that was really just commentary on their own positions, observations about the countryside that were really just descriptions of their own estates, questions about her activities that were really not questions at all, but openings for them to talk about themselves. He was not like that. He asked her things and then waited for the answer. He disagreed with things she said, directly, without the cushioning that men usually deployed when they disagreed with women. And when she countered his disagreements with her own reasoning, he listened. Actually listened, in the way of someone revising their thinking in real time, rather than simply waiting for her to finish speaking. It was disarming, and she did not want to be disarmed. At the Harrington dinner, the third event they attended together, he was seated across from her and to the left. They were not beside each other, and for the first hour, she spoke to the gentleman on her right about the coming summer weather, which was a conversation she could conduct without any part of her real attention. Then the table split into smaller conversations as it always did around the second course, and she heard his voice across the table, low and clear, saying something to Lady Frances Alderton about whether the city's new water infrastructure was being built efficiently or merely expensively, and she found herself listening to him without meaning to, and found she agreed with his point more than she wanted to. After dinner, when the men had rejoined the ladies in the drawing room and the room had relaxed into its usual smaller clusters, he found his way to her side. "You were listening," he said quietly, in a tone that was not accusatory. It was simply accurate. "You made an interesting point about the water infrastructure. You disagree with something I said." She turned to look at him. "I disagree with your conclusion, not your data. Tell me." She told him. She explained why his efficiency argument, while correct in its numbers, overlooked the fact that the neighborhoods with the least efficient infrastructure were precisely the neighborhoods with the least political representation, and that the inefficiency was not a management failure, but a structural one that could not be addressed by management solutions alone. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had not thought about it from that angle." And then, "You have thought about it from that angle because of the school?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. And then, in a very different tone, "The donation was anonymous for a reason, Lady Whitmore. I would prefer it remain so." She went very still. She looked at him. He held her gaze, without apology, and without explanation. "I see," she said. "Do you?" he said. And there was something beneath the question that she could not fully read, something that was not quite challenge, and not quite disclosure, and was somehow both. They were interrupted then by Mrs. Dorothy Hale, who descended on them with the energy of a woman who had been watching from across the room for an excuse to approach, and the conversation was over. But later, riding home in the carriage, with the dark streets sliding past the window, Elara sat with her hands folded in her lap, and thought about a man who had called her school's charity anonymous, who had said she deserved to hear things directly, who had not used her work as a weapon even once in 3 weeks of proximity. She was not softening. She told herself that clearly. She was simply correcting an incorrect portrait. Her friend Frances came to call the next afternoon, and settled into the chair across from her desk with the unhurried confidence of someone who intended to stay until she had the full story. "You are thinking about him again," Frances said. "I am thinking about the arrangement. They are the same thing." Elara set down her pen. "He is not what I expected." "No," Frances said. "He generally isn't, according to anyone who has actually spent time near him, rather than across a ballroom from him. The distance at which society judges people is rarely the distance at which they can actually be seen. Don't be wise at me. I am not in the mood." "What are you in the mood for?" Elara thought about it. "I want to know why he bought my father's debts." Frances looked at her, with the particular expression she used, when she thought Elara was asking the wrong question. "The more interesting question," Frances said carefully, "might be why he came to tell you himself, when he didn't have to." Elara said nothing. Frances stood and smoothed her skirt. "I have an appointment at 3. But I want you to know that whatever you decide to make of this, I am on your side entirely, including if you decide nothing at all, and simply continue observing from a safe and sensible distance. That is exactly what I am doing." "Of course it is," Frances said warmly, and kissed her on the cheek and left. Elara sat for a long moment with the silence of the room around her, and the unfinished letter on her desk, and the particular restlessness of a woman who has spent her whole life knowing her own mind, and has recently encountered something she cannot quite locate in the catalogue of things she understands. She picked up her pen. She did not write the letter. She wrote instead a list of 61 names from memory, from the school ledger, because she always worked better when she remembered why any of this mattered in the first place, and because keeping her purpose clearly in view was the surest way she had ever found to stop herself from being distracted by things she was not yet ready to examine. She finished the list. She looked at it. All 61 names, correct, in the right order. Then she folded the page, put it in the box with the donation letter, and went to make herself a cup of tea, because some thoughts are best addressed after something warm and something practical, and she had learned long ago that the difference between wisdom and foolishness was often simply a matter of which one you acted on before the tea had cooled. The invitation to Lady Pemberton's masquerade arrived on a Tuesday, and was, as all things involving Lady Pemberton were, not really an invitation, so much as a very politely worded instruction. Elara read it at breakfast, set it beside her cup, and thought for a moment. Frances appeared that afternoon, and informed her that she was going, that they were going together, that she had already selected their costumes from a dressmaker on Regent Street, and that she would hear no arguments on any of these points. "I was not going to argue," Elara said. "You had the face," Frances said, "that you make when you are about to argue. That is simply my face. It is the face slightly rearranged into argument adjacency. I know the difference." Frances set down her tea. "The Duke will be there. I assumed as much. The arrangement includes Lady Pemberton's masquerade. It is one of the fixed events of the season." "Yes." Elara looked at the window. It was raining, in the particular half-hearted way that London rain often performed, as though it had begun the effort and then immediately regretted it. "It is a masquerade. We will not be required to speak to each other directly. Everyone will be in costume. The whole point of the evening is to be someone slightly other than yourself. Francis looked at her thoughtfully. Is that a comfort or a concern? It is neither. It is simply a fact. The thing about a masquerade, Francis said, in the voice she used when she was about to say something she had been thinking about for longer than she was admitting, is that it is one of the only evenings when people say what they actually mean, because the mask gives them permission to mean it without consequences. Ilara picked up her cup. That is a romantic notion. It is a true one. Those are not always the same thing. Francis said nothing further on the subject, but she smiled into her tea, and Ilara saw the smile, and chose, on this occasion, to let it pass without comment. Lady Pemberton's masquerade was held on a Friday evening in November, at her house in Mayfair, which was large enough to hold 200 guests without anyone feeling crowded, and old enough to feel like it had hosted a great many secrets over the years, and was quite comfortable with one more. Ilara arrived with Francis at 8:30. She wore a gown the deep blue of winter midnight, with a mask of midnight blue and silver that covered the upper half of her face, and left her mouth and jaw free, which she had specifically requested from the dressmaker, because she disliked the feeling of obstruction near her jaw. Francis had chosen deep gold, and they walked into the ballroom together, looking like night and evening itself, which was Francis's intention, because Francis did everything with intention, and dressed herself as if she were writing a sentence. The ballroom was extraordinary. Lady Pemberton had ordered every lamp lowered and replaced with candlelight, and the room glowed with a warmth that softened edges and lengthened shadows, and gave everyone the slightly unreal quality of people in a painting. Masks of every shape and color moved through the crowd. Voices were lower than usual. Music floated from a string quartet in the far corner, unhurried and warm. Ilara and Francis separated after 20 minutes, which was the natural rhythm of any such evening. Francis was drawn into a circle of acquaintances near the entrance to the garden. Ilara moved through the room with the ease of a woman who had attended a great many events and had long since learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and no more. She was standing near the long windows that overlooked the garden, holding a glass of champagne she had barely touched, when a voice said from just behind her left shoulder, "You are watching the room." She turned. The man beside her wore a deep burgundy costume, a coat that was perfectly fitted and deliberately simple, and a mask of dark red that covered his eyes and the bridge of his nose, and gave him the quality of something both present and unrevealed. He was tall, his voice was low and controlled, but not in the way of coldness, in the way of a person who has learned to modulate because he has not always known what volume to use. She did not recognize him. The mask and the candlelight did their work. "Most people are watching the room," she said. "The alternative is to be watched by it. You look like someone who prefers to see first. Doesn't everyone?" "No," he said. "Most people prefer to be seen first. They spend a great deal of effort arranging themselves for observation before they have even looked at what they are observing." She considered this. It was, she thought, an accurate thing to say, and she had not expected it. "And you?" she asked. "Do you prefer to see first?" "I used to think so," he said. "Now I am less certain. I believe I have spent a long time seeing things incorrectly, which makes the preference somewhat difficult to defend." "What made you uncertain?" He was quiet for a moment. The music shifted to something slower and lower. Across the room, a pair of guests in gold and white began to dance. "Someone showed me," he said, "that I was looking at a very narrow slice of the picture and calling it the whole thing. That is a difficult thing to be shown." "Yes, it is easier when it is done without announcement, when someone simply keeps being what they are, until the picture corrects itself." Ilara looked at him. There was nothing in his manner that she could easily dismiss. No affectation, no performance. He spoke the way she spoke when she was not trying to manage an impression, directly, with the slight hesitation of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than effect. "You speak," she said, "as though you are used to being wrong and having to navigate the consequences." "I am," he said. He said it without any drama, just a plain admission. "I have found that the consequences are generally easier to navigate if one admits the error rather than defending the original position. Not everyone finds that easy." "No, I did not always find it easy. I am still not certain I find it easy. I find it less difficult than I used to." They stood together for a moment in comfortable quiet, which surprised her. Comfortable quiet with a stranger at a masquerade was not an experience she had expected when the evening began. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you at the edge of the room?" He glanced sideways at her. "Why are you?" "I asked first." A small smile moved across the lower half of his face, the only part she could see clearly. It was not the practiced smile she had seen on men at social events, the one that lived near the surface and meant nothing in particular. It was slower. It arrived as if it had come from somewhere further in. "I come to the edge of rooms," he said, "because from here, you can see the whole of them. And because no one approaches the edge without a reason, which means the conversations that happen here tend to be more honest than the ones in the middle." That is a precise observation. I have made it many times. He looked at her. "You have not answered my question." "I am here for the same reason," she said. "The middle of the room requires a kind of performance that I find exhausting after a certain point. Out here, one can simply be." "Yes," he said, with a warmth that suggested she had said something he had been waiting to hear someone else say. They talked for a long time. She could not afterward have said exactly how long, because the music continued, and the candles burned lower, and the crowd moved in its patterns around them, and she lost track of the kind of time that is measured in minutes, and was only aware of the kind that is measured in how much has been said. He told her, without identifying himself, that he had power he had not asked for, and did not always know what to do with, that he had spent a great deal of his life doing what was expected of a man in his position, and had only recently begun to wonder what he might have done if he had spent less time maintaining the shape of his position, and more time asking whether the shape was worth maintaining. She told him she envied no one's power, that what she had always wanted was simply to be taken seriously when she said something true, and that this had proved surprisingly difficult to acquire, regardless of her family's standing. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "I have not always taken people seriously when I should have. No one always does. I mean," he said slowly, "that there is someone I dismissed very quickly, based on what I had heard, rather than what I had actually observed, and that my dismissal was not merely wrong. It was unkind, and the particular quality of the unkindness is that she overheard it." Alara looked at the garden through the dark glass. "What did you say?" "Something that I cannot take back. Something that, if I am honest, I said because I was afraid of exactly the quality that she actually has, which is the worst kind of unkindness, the kind that comes from recognizing something and then using it as a weapon instead of acknowledging it." The room around them was full of laughter and light, and the sound of 200 people being someone slightly other than themselves for an evening. Alara held her glass and thought about a velvet curtain and a voice, and the 3 seconds that had stood between ignorance and knowledge. "People say unkind things," she said. "Sometimes they also do kind things afterward. It does not resolve the unkind thing, but it makes the picture of the person more complete." He looked at her. Even through the mask she could feel the attention of it, the quality of being truly looked at that is different from being merely seen. "You are very precise," he said. "It is a remarkable quality. It is a useful one. It is more than useful, it is rare." She looked at him carefully, this man in burgundy, with the slow smile, and felt something shift in the room that was not the candlelight or the music or any other external cause. "I believe," she said, "that you are asking me to dance." "I have been working up to it," he said. "You do not need to work up to anything. Ask." He asked. She accepted. They danced the way people dance when neither of them is performing for an audience, when the steps are simply the steps, and the space between them is simply the space, and the conversation continues in a different register, conducted through the small communications of how close and how careful, and how much ease is offered and returned. She was a good dancer. He was a better one than she would have expected, fluid without being showy, attentive without being stiff. 3 dances. She did not count them as they happened. She only knew afterward that it had been 3. At the end of the 3rd, she stepped back and looked at him. "You are laughing," he said, a note of something that was not quite surprise in his voice. "I am," she agreed. She was. Something light had moved through her chest during the last dance, and she had not been able to suppress it. "I apologize. It is not directed at you." "What is it directed at?" She shook her head, still smiling. At the evening. At the fact that I did not want to come, and I have been more honest with you in the last 2 hours than I have been with most people in the last 2 years. Because of the mask, he said. Because of the mask, she agreed. And then, more quietly, and because of you. He was still. The kind of still that is not absence of movement, but the opposite of it. Before either of them could say anything more, Frances appeared at her elbow with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been watching the clock. Alara, it is nearly midnight. The masks come off in 10 minutes. Alara looked at the man in burgundy. He looked at her. 10 minutes, he said quietly, and in those 2 words was something that she could not quite name, a kind of decision being made that had not been articulated yet. She did not answer. She let Frances draw her back through the crowd toward the center of the room, where Lady Pemberton was beginning to call for attention. She was aware, without turning around, that the man in burgundy was watching her go. She was also aware, with the kind of certainty that does not require evidence, that the clock striking midnight was going to change something. She was right. She was also not ready for exactly what it was going to change. Frances squeezed her hand. Who was he? She said in a low voice. I don't know, Alara said. You have been talking to him for the better part of 2 hours. I know. Alara looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, its hands edging toward 12. I suppose I am about to find out. The clock struck, and the masks came down. The sound of the clock's final stroke had barely faded when Alara lifted her hand to the sides of her mask and pulled it free. 200 guests did the same, in a ripple of laughter and gasps and recognition, and the room filled with the particular noise of people discovering who had been standing beside them all evening and finding it either delightful or mortifying, or both at once. Alara did not hear any of it. She was looking at the man in burgundy, who had just removed his mask, and was now looking back at her from a distance of perhaps 4 feet, and his face, now fully visible, was one she knew. Edmund Hartwell, the Duke of Ashford, stood before her with his mask in one hand and an expression that she had never seen on him before, unguarded, open, the face of a man who has been caught at something and is assessing, in the space of one breath, how serious the consequences are going to be. She understood, in that same breath, everything she had said to him and everything he had said to her. The unkind thing overheard by a woman who had earned better. The person who had been dismissed based on what was heard rather than what was observed. The fear underneath the cruelty. She felt heat rise in her face, not embarrassment, but the particular sharp flush of anger that comes when something you had decided to leave alone is brought forcibly back to the surface. She said nothing. He said nothing. Around them the room celebrated itself. Frances appeared at Alara's side, looked at the Duke, looked at Alara, and went very still. Lady Whitmore, the Duke said at last. His voice was controlled, but only barely. She could see, now that she was reading his face at close range without a mask in the way, that there was something happening beneath the surface that he was not accustomed to managing. Your Grace, she said. The distance between those 2 words, and the conversation they had just had for 2 hours, was enormous. She could feel the size of it. I was not aware, he said. Nor was I. A pause. I want you to know, he began. Not here, she said quietly, and the firmness of it stopped him. She did not want to have this conversation, in the middle of Lady Pemberton's ballroom, with 200 people newly unmasked around them, and Frances standing 3 inches away, with an expression of careful neutrality that was costing her visible effort. Not now, not here. He closed his mouth. He nodded. She turned to Frances. I would like to leave. Of course, Frances said, and had Alara's wrap and her own in hand before she had finished the sentence. They left without making a scene, which was the correct thing to do, and Alara managed it with the composure of a woman who has spent a great deal of her life making sure that other people do not witness what she is actually feeling at the moments when she is feeling it most acutely. In the carriage, Frances said nothing for a full 10 minutes, which was the longest Alara had ever known her to be silent. Then she said, He was the man in burgundy. Yes. You spoke to him for 2 hours. Yes. You danced with him 3 times. Frances, I am simply observing. Please stop observing. Frances pressed her lips together. They rode in silence for another minute. Then she reached across and took Alara's hand and held it, and that was the correct thing, and Alara was grateful for it. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her writing desk until the early hours with a candle burning down beside her, and turned the evening over and over in her mind. What troubled her was not what she had said. What she had said was honest, and she did not regret honest things, even poorly timed ones. What troubled her was that she had meant all of it. Every word she had said to the man in Burgundy had been true. She had not performed ease and directness. She had actually been easy and direct. She had not pretended at comfort. She had actually been comfortable. She had laughed 3 times. Genuine laughter, the kind that catches you by surprise, rather than the kind you offer as a social response. And all of it had been directed at the man who had stood behind a curtain at a winter ball and said, "God help the man who weds her," without so much as looking to see who might be listening. She was not sure what to do with this. She was not a person who found herself uncertain often, and the unfamiliarity of it made the uncertainty worse. She went to the school the next morning, which was what she always did when she needed to think clearly. The school had that effect on her. The moment she walked through its door and the sounds of children reached her, something settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the rest of her life. She spent 2 hours reviewing the week's lessons with the teachers, correcting a set of arithmetic papers, and helping a 7-year-old named William with the letter W, which he had decided was his personal enemy. When she emerged at noon, the cold November air felt clear and useful. She walked home with her mind doing the thing it did best, which was sort information into order and consider it plainly. The fact that the man in the mask had been the Duke did not change what either of them had said. The conversation had been real, the honesty had been real, the dancing had been real. What changed was the context around it, and context, she had always believed, did not change the truth of a thing. It only changed how convenient the truth was. What he had admitted, under the mask, was that he had said something unkind about someone who overheard it, that the unkindness had come from a place of recognition and fear, and that he had been wrong. He had not known he was admitting it to her, but he had admitted it. That mattered. She was not prepared to say what it mattered in the direction of, not yet, but it mattered. The next morning, a brief note arrived. It was from the Duke's secretary, a man named Philip Osborne, who wrote in a hand that was precise without being ornate, and whose notes always reflected the voice of the man who dictated them. This one was short. It said only that the Duke had requested access to the full operational records of the Whitmore Charitable School, including the teacher correspondence and the attendance documentation from the past 3 years, if Lady Whitmore was agreeable to sharing them for the purpose of a private review. She read it twice. Then she wrote back, yes, she was agreeable, and she would have the documents sent to Ashford House by the end of the week. She did not add anything further. She had the documents sent on Thursday. On Friday morning she received, from the same secretary, a note acknowledging their safe receipt. Nothing more. Days passed. The arrangement continued. They appeared together at a dinner hosted by Sir Arthur Lennox and a reception at the Geological Society, which neither of them had any particular connection to, but which was one of those events that one attended in the season, because not attending was a more visible statement than attending. At both events they were civil and appropriate and spoke as required, and she watched him across tables and rooms and was aware, in a way she had not been before the masquerade, that he was also watching her. Not the way men usually watched women at social events, evaluating or approving or looking for something to use. He watched her the way she watched things she was trying to understand. It was, she decided, the most uncomfortable form of attention she had ever received, and she could not decide whether this was because she resented it or because she did not resent it enough. 3 weeks after the masquerade, she arrived home from the school on a rainy Wednesday afternoon to find a second letter from Philip Osborne waiting for her. The Duke had reviewed the school's records. He had noted the specific resource shortfall she had documented in the third year's reports, the lack of a proper reading library, and the absence of any dedicated materials for mathematics instruction. He wished to address both of these shortfalls directly, if she would permit it. A list of proposed books had been enclosed for her review and amendment. He would defer to her judgment on every selection. Enclosed was a 4-page handwritten list of books, organized by subject and age group, in a hand that was not the secretary's precise script. It was a different hand. Larger, cleaner, with the occasional correction that showed thinking happening in real time. She recognized the hand from the committee room, where he had made a note during her presentation. She sat down at her desk with the 4 pages in front of her, and went through each item carefully. She agreed with most of the selections. She amended 7 of them, adding 3, and removing 4, and wrote her reasons beside each change in the margins. She sent it back the next morning. 2 days later, the revised list came back to her. He had accepted every amendment without argument and added a note at the bottom in that same clear hand. The books would be ordered and delivered to the school within the fortnight, and if she found anything further in the library shortfall that had been missed, she should please let him know. She looked at the note for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, for the first time, a letter that was addressed not to a committee or a secretary, but to the Duke himself. She thanked him for the books. She told him, briefly, that the children's library was the part of the school she had most wanted to build from the beginning, and that she had not been able to secure the funding for it in the first 2 years. She told him, more briefly still, that what he had said at the masquerade, the admission about the unkind thing, was something she had thought about since, and that she had found it informative. She did not say informative in the direction of forgiveness, because she was not ready to say that. She said informative, as in it changed the picture. She sealed the letter, addressed it, and sent it. She did not receive a reply for 4 days, which was long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged the tone entirely. On the 4th day, a letter arrived at Whitmore House, addressed in a hand she now recognized. It contained 3 sentences. The first said that he was grateful she had written. The second said that he had read her letter 3 times before responding, which he understood was perhaps more information than she required, but which he had decided to include on the grounds that honesty had worked better for him lately than its alternative. The third said, I was wrong about you at Pembury's ball, and I said it where you could hear it, and there is no version of that for which I can find an adequate explanation, except the inadequate one I gave you in the dark, which is that I recognized something in you and was afraid of it, and I am sorry. She read the letter once. She put it in the wooden box on her desk, on top of the donation letter and the 61 names. She sat for a while. Then she went to make tea, and stood in the kitchen, with the kettle heating and the gray afternoon light coming through the window, and for the first time, in a very long time, she could feel the actual complicated difficulty of a situation she had not entirely decided how to handle, and she did not find this terrible. She found it, to her own surprise, something very close to interesting, which was, she supposed, a beginning of some kind. Lord Crispin Vane arrived in their social orbit the way that trouble generally arrives, gradually at first, and then all at once. He appeared at the Lennox winter reception in December, with the smooth confidence of a man who knew exactly how he looked, and was entirely satisfied with the answer. He was 40 years old, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a manner that read, at a distance, as charming, and read, up close, as something else, though most people did not get close enough to distinguish between the 2 readings before they had already been charmed. He was wealthy. His estate in Wiltshire was large and well maintained, and his income was frequently discussed in the rooms where incomes were discussed, because it was the kind of income that generated its own commentary. He had been briefly married in his early 30s, and was not married now, and the general social understanding was that he had simply not yet found a woman who met his requirements, which everyone assumed were very particular. He was introduced to Alara at the Lennox reception by their host, who performed introductions the way some men play chess, enthusiastically and without enough attention to consequences. Lady Whitmore, said Lord Vane, and took her hand and held it a fraction of a second longer than necessary. I have heard a great deal about you. Have you? She said, removing her hand at a pace that was polite enough to be imperceptible and definitive enough to communicate her meaning. Your school in Whitechapel in particular. A remarkable undertaking. Thank you. It takes courage, he said, for a woman of your position to commit so publicly to something so unconventional. She looked at him. The word unconventional had been delivered with a particular lightness that made it mean something other than praise. She recognized the technique, a compliment shaped like a warning, designed to communicate awareness of vulnerability without quite saying so. I think of it as practical rather than courageous, she said. There are children in this city who cannot read. Supplying them with teachers and books is simply a reasonable response to a situation that does not require bravery so much as organization. Lord Vane smiled. The smile went all the way to the right places. Modest as well, he said. No, she said pleasantly. Accurate. He laughed. It was a good laugh, full-bodied and apparently genuine, and she distrusted it immediately on both counts. She excused herself after 2 minutes and circulated to another group, and did not think about Lord Vane again until she noticed, half an hour later, that he had positioned himself at an angle to the room from which he had a clear view of her, without appearing to be looking directly at her. She had no proof of this. It was a feeling. She catalogued it and moved on. She mentioned none of this to anyone that evening. She mentioned it to Francis the next morning, because Francis was the appropriate repository for things that needed to be said aloud once in order to be examined properly. Francis listened carefully. Then she said, "Vane. You know him?" "I know of him. My cousin Charlotte had a friend who was courted by him 3 years ago. It did not proceed." "Why not?" Francis chose her words carefully, which was always a sign she was choosing them very carefully. "He is a man," she said, "who presents himself one way to the world, and behaves another way in the private spaces, where presentation is no longer required. The friend found this out late enough that extracting herself was unpleasant." "How unpleasant?" "Unpleasant in the way that things are unpleasant when someone has begun to treat something as already decided when it is not." Alara filed this information in the part of her mind that she kept for things that needed to be remembered without becoming an obsession. "He is interested in the school," she said. "He is interested in you. The school is the opening he is using. He has known me for less than 2 hours." "Yes," Francis said, "I know." They sat with that for a moment. "Does the Duke know him?" Alara asked, and then wondered, immediately, why that had been the natural second question. Francis looked at her with the expression she used when she had noticed something, and was deciding whether to name it. "They know each other," she said. "They are in the same club. They are not friends. My understanding is that they are politely cold to each other, which in the language of that kind of men, means a temperature somewhere just above dislike. Why? I could not say precisely. Something in the past, perhaps. Men of that world collect old frictions, and keep them in good repair." Francis paused. "Does it matter?" Alara thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. Over the next 3 weeks, Lord Vane appeared at every event that Alara attended. She could not determine if this was coincidence or engineering, because the circles in which they moved were small enough that coincidence was plausible, but the frequency of it passed plausible somewhere around the 3rd time, and by the 5th, she had stopped giving coincidence any credit. He was always courteous, always precisely within the bounds of what was acceptable. He brought her champagne once without being asked, and she accepted it, because refusing would have been a larger statement than accepting, and she was not ready to make any statement yet. He asked about the school in detail on 2 occasions, and his questions were, she had to admit, intelligent ones. He listened to her answers with full attention. He was, in every observable way, behaving as a man who was sincerely interested in someone he admired. She watched him behave this way, and felt the same faint unease she had felt at the Lennox reception, the sense of something being performed with too much polish, too much attention to how it looked from the outside. But she was a woman who believed in evidence. She did not have evidence. She had a feeling, and a second-hand account, and the memory of a hand held slightly too long at a first meeting. She told herself to watch and wait. At the Pemberton charity concert in mid-December, she was standing near the program table when she heard Lord Vane's voice from the adjacent room, speaking in low but audible tones to a man she did not know. She did not move closer. She did not move away either. She heard her own name. She heard Lord Vane say, in the tone of a man discussing an acquisition rather than a person, "The situation with her father is well known in certain circles. The right approach is simply patience." She stood very still. The other man said something she could not make out. Lord Vane replied, "She is not difficult to manage if one approaches it correctly. The reputation for being difficult is largely a story she tells herself. The right circumstances will resolve it." She walked away. She walked calmly, and with purpose, to the far side of the room, and stood near the window, with her program in her hand, and she breathed through the heat that had risen in her face, which was not distress, not vulnerability, but something colder and cleaner. something that was very close to resolution. The right circumstances will resolve it. She had been reduced, in 2 sentences, to a problem to be managed, a complication to be smoothed, something that would yield if the correct pressure were applied in the correct sequence. She had been many things in her life, and had been called many things, some of them unkind, some of them accurate, some of them both. She had been called ungovernable. She had been called difficult. She had been called an original, which people sometimes meant as a compliment, and sometimes meant as the opposite of one. She had never minded any of it, because none of it had been a strategy. This was different. She rejoined the concert, with her composure fully restored, and sat through an hour of music with the particular quality of stillness she had developed over many years, the ability to be entirely present in a room, while a separate part of her mind was working on something she had not yet decided to share with anyone. Lord Vane made his way to her during the interval. She was pleasant. She was brief. She gave him nothing he could have pointed to as encouragement, and she gave him nothing he could have pointed to as coldness. This was a skill she had perfected through years of managing exactly this kind of situation, the art of being entirely cordial while being entirely withholding, so that the person on the other end could not account for why they had made so little progress. He looked, when he excused himself, faintly puzzled in the way of a man who has deployed his best technique and found it producing no visible result. Good, she thought. On the other side of the concert room, Edmund Hartwell was in conversation with Sir Arthur Lennox. He was not looking at her, but she had the feeling, based on no evidence she could precisely locate, that he was aware she was there, in the specific way that awareness operates when it is being carefully not demonstrated. She went home that night, and sat at her desk with the small wooden box open in front of her, not looking at what was in it, but simply knowing it was there, and she thought about the word manage, and what it meant when a person applied it to another person, and about the different ways in which people could make you feel small, and about the fact that some people did it loudly, at winter balls, with words that rang off the walls and into ears they had not seen. And some people did it quietly, in adjacent rooms, in the low, assured tones of a man who had already decided the outcome. She thought about the difference between those 2 things. The first kind had come with an apology, a real one, 3 sentences in a letter that had read like something it cost the writer to write. The second kind did not yet know it needed to produce anything at all. She closed the box. She thought about the conversation she had not had yet, the conversation with the Duke about Lord Vane. She had not mentioned Vane to him because there had been nothing to mention except a feeling, and she did not bring feelings to conversations before she had examined them fully. She had now examined it fully. She did not yet know exactly what she was going to do. She knew she was not frightened because she was not a person who frightened easily, and because she had faced more complicated situations than a wealthy lord with too much patience and too little honesty. But she also knew, with the precision that characterized most of her thinking, that Lord Crispin Vane was not simply an unwanted suitor who would eventually receive her polite refusal and move on. She had heard the certainty in his voice. He had not sounded like a man preparing to be refused. He had sounded like a man who had already decided that refusal was not part of the available options. This, she thought, was going to require a different kind of attention than she had given it so far. She rose from the desk, straightened the objects on it in the habitual way she had of ordering her physical space when she was ordering her thoughts, and went to bed. She slept well, which surprised her, but she had always slept best when a situation had clarified itself sufficiently for her to know what she was actually dealing with. She now knew what she was dealing with. She was less certain what she was going to do about it, but that was a question for tomorrow, and she had always found that questions which could wait until tomorrow generally looked different in the morning, which was a fact she had come to trust more than any plan made in the late hours of a night when the day's events were still too close to see clearly. She would see clearly in the morning. She always did. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, written on Lord Vane's personal stationery, in a hand that was elegant in the same way his manners were elegant, carefully, deliberately, so that the elegance itself became a kind of armor. He wrote to request a private meeting, at her convenience, on a matter that he believed would be of mutual interest. He suggested Thursday afternoon. He suggested the small drawing room at the Alderton Club, which hosted mixed company on Thursday afternoons, and which was therefore appropriate as a venue, without requiring her to receive him at her home. a detail so precisely calculated that it told her, had she needed telling, that this was not an impulsive communication. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she wrote back, Thursday, 3 o'clock. She told no one. She considered telling Francis, and decided not to, because she did not want to walk into the meeting, having already had someone else's assessment of it shaping her own. She wanted to walk in clear. She arrived at the Alderton Club at 3 minutes, a timing that she chose deliberately, because arriving before the appointed hour gave her 2 minutes to settle herself in the room before he arrived, which was a small advantage but a real one, and she had learned long ago never to refuse a small advantage. The drawing room was comfortable and quiet. A fire burned in the grate. There were other people at distant tables, far enough away that a low conversation at her table would not be audible, which she suspected was exactly the arrangement Lord Vane had been counting on when he suggested the venue. He arrived at 3 exactly. He was dressed as he always was, precisely, expensively, with the kind of considered casualness that takes considerable effort to produce. He ordered tea with a word to the attendant, and sat down across from her, with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in any room he walks into. "Lady Whitmore," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she said, "you mentioned a matter of mutual interest. I am curious what that interest might be." He smiled. He had a way of smiling that arrived slightly before the warmth did, so that you were aware of the smile's existence before you were aware of whether it was sincere. "I am going to be direct with you," he said, "because I think you are a woman who appreciates directness." "Yes," she said. "I do." "Good." He lifted his cup when it arrived, held it, did not drink from it. "I have been conducting business in London for a number of years, Lady Whitmore, and in the course of that business, I have become aware of certain financial arrangements involving various families. Most of these arrangements are of no relevance to me at all. A small number are." She looked at him across the table. "Your father," he said, "accrued significant debts over several years. I believe you are aware of this." "I am," she said. "I believe you are also aware that those debts were purchased by a private buyer approximately 18 months ago, and have not, as of the arrangement your family entered into, been formally dissolved." She kept her face very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Lord Vane said, in the quiet and reasonable tone of a man explaining a business matter to a reasonable person, "that I have in my possession documentation relating to your father's original debts. Not the purchased obligations, the original creditor agreements, predating the acquisition. Documents that, while no longer the active instruments of collection, are nonetheless public record, and are descriptive of a situation that your family's current social standing would, in the relevant circles, find uncomfortable." She said nothing. He continued, "These documents are of no value to me from a financial standpoint. They cannot be used to collect anything. Their value is entirely reputational in nature." She understood him precisely. She had understood him from the third sentence. She had continued listening, not because she needed more information, but because she wanted to know exactly how far he intended to go. He went as far as she had feared. "I am not," he said, "interested in causing difficulty for your family, Lady Whitmore. I want to be clear about that. I am interested in a future arrangement, a personal one. I believe we are well suited to each other in a number of respects, and I believe a formal understanding between us would be beneficial to both parties." The tea sat between them, cooling. "You are proposing marriage," she said. She said it flatly, because the flatness was the only appropriate register in which to receive what he was saying. "I am proposing a conversation about the possibility," he said. "I want nothing to happen quickly. I simply want you to be aware that I have given this a great deal of thought, and that I believe your own thinking, given sufficient time and the right context, might arrive at a similar place." She looked at him with the kind of attention that she reserved for things she was storing precisely in her memory. "I see," she said. "I want this to be a comfortable conversation," he said. "I am not making a demand. I am making a proposal." "You are making a threat," she said. He looked at her without blinking. "That is a very strong interpretation of a courtesy call." "Is it?" she said. Not a question. He set his cup down. He leaned back slightly, and the arrangement of his body shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but which she noticed, a movement from studied ease to something more deliberate. I would prefer we not use language that suggests conflict, he said. I would prefer we think of this as an opening to a discussion. You prefer a great many things, she said. I notice that what you prefer aligns very closely with what is convenient for you. He smiled again, and this time the warmth was entirely absent. You are exactly as direct as I had heard. Yes, she said. I am. She rose from her chair. She did it without haste, at a pace that communicated she was not being driven from the table, but was leaving it of her own volition. I appreciate your candor, Lord Vane, she said. I will give this matter the consideration it deserves. I hope you will, he said. I think, if you consider it calmly and without the first reaction, you will find that the situation is not as constrained as it might initially appear. She looked at him for one final moment. The situation, she said, is exactly as constrained as it appears, and possibly more so. Good afternoon. She walked out of the Alderton Club drawing room with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout, and she did not hurry, because hurrying would have looked like distress, and she was not distressed. She was furious. There is a kind of anger that operates at a very high temperature and manifests as extreme calm, and that was what she was carrying as she walked out onto the street and into the gray December afternoon. The cold air hit her face, and she stood on the pavement for a moment before hailing a cab, letting the cold do what cold does, clarify things. He had those documents. He had made his intention clear without technically making a threat, which was the particular cleverness of what he had done. The ability to do something that could, in a conversation afterward, be described as merely a frank discussion, while being, in actual substance, a matter of considerable pressure. She got into the cab and sat very upright on the worn leather seat as it moved through the city. She thought about her father, Gerald Whitmore, with his kind eyes and his hopeful posture, who had been working so hard this past year to believe that the problem of the debts had been resolved, and that things were going to be easier from now on, who had begun, in the past several months, to be himself again, in a way that she had not seen in several years, who laughed at dinner now, and who had begun to correspond again with the agricultural society he had been part of in his earlier years, and had let drift. She thought about what those documents, circulated in the right rooms to the right people, would do to him. She thought about her school. And then, quietly and with great clarity, she thought about the Duke. She thought about a letter with 3 sentences, and the middle one that said, I have read your letter 3 times before responding, which he had included because he had decided that honesty had worked better for him lately than its alternative. She thought about a list of books in a hand she recognized. She thought about the committee room, and about 4 votes to 1. She thought about a man standing at the edge of a room at a masquerade, watching the crowd with the expression of someone who had spent a long time doing what was expected, and was only recently beginning to wonder whether the expectations were worth the effort. She did not reach any conclusions in the cab. She was not yet ready to reach conclusions. What she was doing was taking stock of everything she had, looking at it plainly, and deciding what she actually had to work with. When she arrived home, she went directly to her desk. She did not sit down. She stood at it and looked at the closed box where she kept the things she needed to remember. The donation letter. The list of 61 names. 3 sentences. She stood there for several minutes. Then she moved to the window and looked out at the street and let herself feel, for the space of 1 full minute, the full weight of the situation she was in. The documents, her father's peace, the school she had built with 4 years of effort and considerable personal cost, and the man who had just made clear that he intended to use all of it as leverage. The minute passed. She straightened. She sat down at the desk, took out a sheet of paper, and began to write. She was not writing to Lord Vane. She was not writing to Francis. She was not yet writing to the Duke. She was writing to herself, which was what she had always done when a situation required thinking that was too large for the inside of her head alone. She wrote out the full situation, every detail, in the clear, careful sentences that had always served her better than emotion, when emotion was what the situation most wanted to provoke. She wrote for an hour. When she finished, she read it back. And then she put it in the box with the other things, closed the lid, and sat back in her chair. She did not cry. She did not shake. She did not do any of the things that the situation might have been designed to produce. She simply sat with it, the way she always sat with hard things, without flinching, and without pretending the hardness was not there. Then she picked up her pen again, and wrote a second letter. This one was short. It contained 2 lines. She addressed it to Ashford House. It said, "I find I need to speak with you, not as a social arrangement, as something else. If you are available Thursday evening, I would be grateful for the conversation." She sealed it. She told herself she was making a practical decision. She told herself this was simply the most efficient path through the situation, given what she now knew about the documents, and what the Duke had told her about their dissolution. She told herself all of this in the firm, reasonable voice she used when she was making the correct decision, and did not want to examine too closely what other decisions it might be adjacent to. Then she gave the letter to the housemaid to post, and went to make tea, and did not think about it again until the next morning, when she woke up thinking about it with such immediate clarity that she knew she had been thinking about it all night, even while she slept. The reply arrived by the afternoon post. It said, "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, Ashford House. I will be here." She read it once, put it in the box. Then she went to the school, because the school was always the thing that steadied her when everything else was moving, and because she needed, more than anything, to sit for an hour in a room full of children who had no idea that the world beyond the school door was doing what worlds always do, which was arranging itself in complicated patterns and requiring the people inside it to be steadier than they always felt. She was steady. She went to the school, and she was steady. And on Thursday evening, she was going to say what needed to be said. And then she was going to see what happened next. Ashford House stood at the end of a quiet street in Belgravia and had the quality that very old buildings acquire over time, which is the quality of knowing exactly what it is. It did not try to impress anyone. It simply was what it was, large and well-ordered, and considerably older than most of the things around it. Ilara arrived at 7 o'clock precisely. She had been inside Ashford House once before, at the start of the social arrangement, when she and her father had attended the first of the fortnightly dinners. On that occasion, she had been careful to look at everything and remember it: the proportion of the entrance hall, the height of the ceilings, the particular quality of the light in the main reception rooms, which was the warm and settled light of a house that had not been recently redecorated to impress anyone, because it did not feel the need. Tonight there were no other guests. The dinner table was not set. The house was quiet in the way that large houses are quiet when only one person occupies them. Philip Osborne, the Duke's secretary, showed her into the library. The library was the room she would have chosen for this conversation herself, had she been given the choice. It was lined floor to ceiling, with books on 3 walls, with a fireplace on the 4th, and it smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular specific warmth of a room where someone had been spending their evenings for a long time. 2 chairs faced the fireplace at a comfortable angle. A low table between them held a tray with tea already poured. The Duke was standing at the far window when she came in. He turned, and she was aware again of the things she had noticed at the masquerade. The difference between how he looked at a distance and how he looked up close. At a distance, he had the quality of his position: formidable, contained, a surface with no obvious texture. Up close, he had the quality of the man underneath that surface, which was something considerably more difficult to manage, because it was considerably more real. "Lady Whitmore," he said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the promptness of your reply," she said. They sat. She took the tea he offered, because her hands needed something to hold, which she acknowledged to herself as a piece of information about her own state, that it was better to be honest about. "You said," he began, and then paused, and started again, in a way that told her he had rehearsed an opening and decided against it. "You said, not as a social arrangement." "Yes." "Then tell me what it is." She told him everything. She told it in the same order, and with the same precision, that she had used when she had written it down for herself. Lord Vane's arrival in their social circle, the frequency of his appearances, the conversation she had overheard at the concert, the letter requesting a meeting, the meeting itself, every sentence of it, including the last one about considering it calmly and without the first reaction. She told it the way she would have told it to a colleague whose intelligence she respected and whose response she needed to hear clearly, which meant she kept her voice level, and she kept her face from performing anything, and she stopped speaking only when she had said all of it, and not before. The Duke listened without interrupting once. She had spoken for perhaps 15 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet, except for the fire. He did not speak immediately. He sat with his hands around his cup and looked at the fireplace with the expression of a man who is deciding not between two options, but within a single option, sorting through it. Then he said, "The documents he has." "Yes. I told you when we spoke at the Harrington dinner that the debts had been dissolved. You implied it. I should have said it plainly." He looked at her. "They were dissolved. The original creditor agreements were settled and absorbed when I purchased the obligations 18 months ago. Legally, those documents can no longer be used to establish any claim against your father." "I know," she said, "but you said legally." "Yes," he said. "He is not threatening a legal action." "No," he said. "He is threatening social circulation of information that is technically no longer actionable, but is still, to the right audience, damaging." "Yes." He set his cup down. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, in a posture she had not seen from him before, something less formal, more direct, as if the furniture of his usual manner was being put aside. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "When you wrote to me on Thursday, was it because of this situation, or was there another reason as well?" She looked at him. He held her gaze, with the steadiness of someone who has decided to be direct, and is going to be direct regardless of what it costs him. And she understood, in that moment, that the question was not a small one. He was asking whether she had come to him as a practical solution to a specific problem, or whether there was something else. She answered honestly, because she always answered honestly, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. "Both," she said. He nodded, slowly, as if this was what he had needed to know, and now that he knew it, he could proceed. "Vane," he said, and the word was flat and very quiet. "He has miscalculated." "Has he?" "Significantly." He stood from his chair. She watched him move to the fireplace, where he stood with one hand on the mantelpiece, and his face turned slightly toward the fire, rather than fully toward her, in the posture of someone thinking alongside a person, rather than at them. The documentation he is holding describes a situation that no longer exists. His entire position depends on the social weight of that documentation being sufficient to produce the result he wants, before anyone examines the legal reality. It is not a strong position. It is the position of a man who is betting that you will not call his hand. He has counted on the fact that calling his hand requires making the situation public, she said, which has its own costs. Yes. He turned then, and looked at her directly. Unless the response to him changes the context so completely that the documentation loses its social power, before he can use it. She looked at him. "What kind of response?" she said carefully. "Changes the context." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who did not know the answer, the quiet of someone who knew the answer and was deciding how to say it. "If the situation between your family and mine," he said at last, "were understood to be something other than a seasonal arrangement, the documentation Vane holds would become irrelevant. The social risk it represents to your father would not survive the change in context. A family in an arrangement of convenience can be embarrassed by past difficulties. A family that is about to enter a permanent alliance with Ashford House cannot." She was still. She said, "That is a significant response to a specific problem." "Yes," he said, "it is." "You are talking about something permanent." "Yes." She stood from her chair, not to leave, but because she could not have this conversation sitting down. She moved to the other side of the fireplace and stood facing him across it, and the fire was between them, and also not between them at all. And she thought about all the conversations that had led to this one, the committee room, the arrangement, the masquerade, the letters. "I need you to hear something," she said. "I am listening. I am not going to accept a solution to this situation," she said, "that is itself a transaction. I am not going to be moved from one arrangement into another one. If what you are suggesting is a strategic response to Lord Vane, then it is a generous one, and I appreciate the impulse behind it, and I cannot accept it on those terms." He said, "That is not what I am suggesting. Then tell me what you are suggesting." Another pause, longer this time. "I am suggesting," he said carefully, that the situation with Vane happens to require a response that I have been thinking about for other reasons. The timing makes it look like strategy. It is not only strategy. She looked at him. How much not only, she said. Something moved across his face that she had not seen from him before. Something that was not quite discomfort and not quite uncertainty, but was in the neighborhood of both. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked back at her. I have read your letters, he said, more times than I have ever read anything. I have thought about the things you said at the masquerade, before either of us knew who the other one was. More clearly than I have thought about most things I have decided with full information and deliberate attention. I have had a picture of you in my head for several years that was wrong in almost every particular, and the process of correcting that picture has been one of the most informative experiences of my recent life. And I use informative because it is the most accurate word I have, even though it is also the least sufficient one. She was very still. I am not suggesting a solution to a problem, he said. I am saying that the solution to this particular problem happens to coincide with something I have been trying to find a way to say, and the coincidence is real, but the thing itself is not a coincidence. She breathed. She said, You are not very practiced at this. No, he said, I am not. It shows, she said, and she was not being unkind. She was being precise, in the way that she had always been precise about everything, and he received it as what it was, which was a form of honesty that she only offered when she was not maintaining a safe distance. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know. She turned and looked into the fire and thought, for what felt like a very long time, about all of it, everything that had been said, and everything that had not yet been said, and about what it meant to be standing in someone's library at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, with the comfortable weight of a conversation that had been going in this direction for months, even when she had been looking carefully in the other direction. She thought about the velvet curtain. She thought about 3 sentences. She thought about 61 names in a box. She turned back toward him. Lord Vane's documentation, she said, is legally unenforceable. Yes. And socially threatening only within a very narrow window, before anyone examines the legal reality. Yes. And you have a response that closes that window. Yes. And you are also saying that you have a reason for that response that is not related to the window. Yes, he said. I am also saying that. She looked at him for a long moment. He held it. He was good. She had come to understand, at holding things. He held his positions, and his silence, and his uncertainty, with a steadiness that she found, now that she had access to the real version of it, rather than the surface version, to be one of the things about him that she most respected. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right? All right, she repeated. I will not give you an answer tonight. That would be unreasonable, and I am not an unreasonable person. But I will tell you that what you have said is something I am willing to consider, rather than something I am unwilling to hear. He breathed. She heard it. That is more than I expected, he said. You set very modest expectations. I have found it useful, he said, when dealing with situations where I want the outcome badly enough that I don't trust my own assessment of what is possible. She looked at him. Something in the room had changed, and she could feel the change in the way you can feel a change in air pressure. Not visible, not dramatic, but present and undeniable. I am going to go home, she said, and I am going to think. I would like you to give me the time to think without inquiring. Of course, he said. And I would like you to know, she said, standing and setting down her cup with the precision of someone choosing her words with the same care she would give to any important document, that the picture I had of you was also wrong, in more than one particular. She left him standing by the fireplace. She went home in the cab with the city moving around her, and her hands folded in her lap, and her mind, for once in its very efficient and orderly life, doing something that was not precisely thinking, so much as simply being in the presence of a thing it had not expected to find here. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she knew, in the quiet and certain way that she knew most things she knew properly, that whatever she was going to do, it was going to be real. That was the part she had not been able to promise herself for a very long time. It was enough, for tonight, to know it was possible. She had asked him for time, and he gave it to her. 3 days passed without a letter from Ashford House. This was significant because Philip Osborne's notes had, over the preceding months, arrived with a frequency that she had come to recognize as the Duke's version of continued attention. Not intrusive, not demanding, but present in the way of something that had decided it was interested and was being honest about the fact. The silence now was deliberate and disciplined, and she knew it cost him something, which was itself information. She spent the 3 days doing the things she normally did, at the pace and with the attention she normally gave them, because she had always believed that large decisions should be made inside an ordinary life, rather than in the suspended, slightly airless state that large decisions often generated when people cleared everything else away to focus on them. The ordinary life was the context. Removing it to examine the decision was like trying to understand a river by removing the water. On the first morning, she went to the school. It was a bright winter day, cold and clear, and the children arrived in coats and boots and with the bright faces that children have when the air is sharp and they have been running from the corner to the door to keep warm. She heard the word problem from the eldest classroom and went in to see what the difficulty was. The teacher, a sharp and capable woman named Mrs. Edith Frost, had set the class a problem in long division that was, on reflection, 2 steps beyond where they actually were, and the resulting confusion had filled the room with a particular anxious silence that Alara recognized immediately as the silence of children who are afraid of being wrong. She took the problem on the board, broke it into its stages, worked through the first stage with the class, and watched the silence convert itself into something else. The sound of pencils moving, of thinking being done, the specific sound of people finding out they can do something they thought they couldn't. She stayed for an extra hour. On the second morning, she wrote to Lord Vane. The letter took considerable effort, not because she did not know what she wanted to say, but because what she wanted to say had to be said in a way that was unambiguous, true, and produced no useful opening for him to continue through. She wrote 4 drafts. The 4th was correct. It was 4 sentences long. She told him she had considered his proposal with the care it required. She told him she was not interested in the arrangement he had described. She told him she was aware that his documentation described a situation that had no current legal standing, and that she intended to proceed on that basis. She told him she wished him well in his future endeavors. She sealed it and sent it before she could reconsider any particular word, because reconsideration was sometimes useful and sometimes the enemy of the correct decision, and she could tell which kind this was. On the second afternoon, Frances came. She had not been summoned. She rarely was. She simply appeared when she sensed she was needed, which was a quality Alara had always found both extraordinary and slightly inconvenient, because Frances's timing was accurate enough to be eerie. She sat across from Alara in the usual chair and looked at her with the frank assessment of long familiarity. "You've done something," Frances said. "Several things. The important one." Alara looked at the window. Outside, a cart horse moved slowly through the gray street, its breath steaming in the cold air. "I wrote to Vane." "What did you say?" "That I am not interested, that I know the documents have no legal standing, that I am proceeding accordingly." Frances was quiet for a moment. "He will not take that well." "No, I expect he won't." "What will you do if he circulates the documents anyway, out of spite?" "Face it," Alara said simply. "It would be unpleasant. It would be survivable. My father's health and peace are more important than his reputation in the specific circles where this kind of thing causes damage, and he is old enough that we could manage a relocation if it came to that." She paused. "But I do not think it will come to that." Frances waited. "Because," Alara said, "the context has changed." Frances looked at her. Then she said, very carefully, "In what way has the context changed?" "The Duke," Alara said something to me on Thursday evening that means that if Vane attempts to circulate anything, the social weight of Ashford House is now on the other side of the scale." Frances sat very still. "Alara," she said, "I know." "What did he say?" She told her. Not everything, because some things were not yet hers alone to tell, but enough. She told her about the library and the fire and the particular quality of a conversation between 2 people who have been working up to it for months and have both finally decided that working up to it is taking longer than either of them can sustain. Frances listened with her hands folded and her face doing something complicated that resolved, eventually, into a kind of careful happiness. "Are you going to accept?" she asked, when Alara was finished. "I am considering it." What is left to consider? Alara thought about this honestly. Whether what he said is what I think it is, she said. Whether what I feel is what I think it is. Whether those two things are compatible in a lasting way, rather than just a present one. Frances looked at her, with the expression of someone who can see the answer clearly, and is choosing, out of respect, not to say so before the other person has arrived at it independently. "He said," Alara continued, slowly, "that the process of correcting the picture he had of me had been one of the most informative experiences of his recent life. And he used the word informative because it was the most accurate word he had, even though it was also the least sufficient one." Frances was quiet. "That is," Alara said, "the most honest thing I have ever heard a man say about another person." "Yes," Frances said. "He was not performing it." "No," Frances agreed. "He has never, from everything you have told me, been performing it. That is what is so unusual about him, and so unlike what everyone said of him from a distance." Alara sat with this. "I know exactly what I want," she said finally, in the tone of someone acknowledging something that has been true for longer than they have been willing to admit. "I am simply verifying that wanting it is a sufficient basis." "It is," Frances said. "Combined with everything else you have described, it is entirely sufficient. You are not usually this decisive on other people's behalf." "I am usually this decisive," Frances said. "I usually choose not to say so. This is the exception." On the third morning, Alara sat at her desk for 2 hours without writing anything. She was not procrastinating. She was doing what she had always done when a large thing required her full attention. She was sitting with it in its entirety, holding the whole shape of it without immediately trying to reduce it to a manageable size. She thought about who she was and what she had built, the school, the independence of mind that she had maintained through years of social pressure to be a different, quieter, more accommodating version of herself, the fierce precision with which she had always named things accurately, even when the accurate name was uncomfortable. She thought about what it meant to spend your life guarding something, and about how the act of guarding something long enough begins, eventually, to become its own kind of prison. She thought about standing in a library at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, with a fire between two people, and the particular feeling in a room when two things that have been moving toward each other finally arrive at the same point. She thought about what the Duke had said at the masquerade, through his mask and hers, before either of them knew who the other was, that he had spent a great deal of his life doing what was expected of a man in his position, and had only recently begun to wonder what he might have done if he had spent less time maintaining the shape of his position, and more time asking whether the shape was worth maintaining. She had been doing the same thing, maintaining the shape of herself as a woman who did not need this kind of thing, who had built her life on her own terms, and had no room in it for the complication of a man she could not predict or safely categorize. She had been wrong too. Not about who she was, about what she had room for. She stood. She took a sheet of paper. She did not draft the letter 4 times. She wrote it once, because she had been thinking about it for 3 days, and it was ready. She wrote, "I have thought about what you said. I have thought about the things I have not yet said, which are different from what I said in your library, and which are also relevant. I think they should be said in person. If you are free on Saturday, I would like to come to Ashford House again." She sealed it and posted it. She went to make tea. She stood in the kitchen in the winter light, and felt, for the first time in a long time, not the restlessness she had been carrying like a familiar weight, but something lighter. Not certainty, because she was too precise a person to call something certainty before she had finished the work of arriving at it, but the knowledge that the direction was correct, the feeling of being on a road that you have chosen, rather than a road that has simply been arranged around you. His reply came by the afternoon post. It said, "Saturday, 2 o'clock. I will be here." And then, at the bottom of the page, in a handwriting that was slightly less controlled than his usual precise hand, as if it had been added quickly and then not removed because removing it would have been a different kind of dishonesty. "I have not stopped thinking about what you said either. The part about both. She read it twice. She put it in the wooden box. She looked at the box for a moment. The donation letter, the 61 names, the 3 sentences, and now this. She closed the lid. Saturday felt a very long way away. She went to the school on Friday and did not think about Saturday at all, which was a lie she permitted herself because she was almost certain she would have been completely ineffective at the school if she had not permitted it, and the children deserved her full attention, which they received, because she had always been able to give the thing in front of her the attention it required, regardless of what else was happening in the larger territories of her life. She heard William's letter W again. He was improving. He sat with his tongue between his teeth, and formed each letter with the methodical seriousness of a child who has decided to master something and is not going to be hurried about it. Good, she told him, when he had written the full alphabet correctly for the first time. He looked at his paper with an expression of profound satisfaction. She knew that expression. She had worn it herself, many times, at the completion of something she had worked on until it was right. It looked the same at 7 as it did at 32. She went home that evening and slept, and in the morning she woke clear and steady, the way she always woke when she had decided something and the decision had settled properly overnight, and she got up and put on the correct dress, and at 20 minutes to 2 she got into a cab and told the driver the address. Ashford House was the same as it had always been, the same old stones, the same settled certainty about what it was. She stood on the step for one moment. Then she knocked. Philip Osborne opened the door with the practiced courtesy of a man who had been in this house long enough to be part of its character rather than simply its function, and he showed her in with the particular careful correctness of someone who was very aware of the occasion but was not going to acknowledge it in any way that was not strictly professional. She liked Philip Osborne. The library again. She had wondered if it would be. She decided, walking through the door, that it was the right room for this, just as it had been the right room for Thursday. Libraries were honest rooms. They contained everything that had ever been thought carefully enough to be written down, and the accumulated weight of that was useful for the kind of conversation that required you to mean what you said. The Duke was at the window when she entered, the same window as Thursday. She thought, briefly, that this was a habit he had, standing at windows, looking out at the city or the garden or whatever was outside, and she filed it away with the other things she had accumulated about him over the past several months: his preference for accuracy over impression, his habit of the edges of rooms, his handwriting, the quality of his silence when he was thinking. He turned. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was the correct response to walking into a room where something important was about to happen. He gestured toward the chairs. They sat. He said, "You wrote that there were things you had not said." "Yes. I have been wondering," he said, "what they were." She had thought about how to begin this for 2 days. She had thought about beginnings in the way she thought about everything, thoroughly, from multiple angles, until she had found the one that was most accurate. But now that she was here, in the room with him, with the fire doing its steady work in the grate, and the books behind her, and his attention on her face, with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate with him, she found that the prepared beginning had dissolved, the way prepared things sometimes do when the actual moment arrives, and what was left was simply the truth, with nothing around it. She said, "I did not come to you on Thursday, only because of Vane." "I know," he said. "I came because I have been thinking about you since the committee room," she said, in a way that I have been careful not to examine too directly, and Vane's situation made it necessary to stop being careful. He was very still. "I came," she said, "because I have read your letters more times than I have read most documents I have had a professional reason to read, and that is information about my own state that I would have preferred to discover in different circumstances, but that does not change what it means." He said, "What does it mean?" She looked at him steadily. "I think you know." "I want to hear you say it," he said, and there was nothing demanding about it. It was the voice of someone who had spent a long time managing words at a safe distance from what he actually wanted to say, and who was now, for the first time in a very long time, in a room with someone who he believed might say a true thing if he asked for it. "It means," she said, "that I have been, for some months, more interested in you than I have wanted to admit, and that what you said on Thursday night was not a surprise to me, in the way of a new piece of information, but in the way of an old one, finally being named. The fire made a small sound. Outside, London moved in its indifferent way. Neither of them was paying any attention to any of it. He stood from his chair. She watched him. He moved to the window again, which she had already identified as the thing he did when he was thinking something through that he was about to say. He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the winter garden behind the house, which was bare and contained, and had the clean lines of a well-ordered place that was waiting patiently for spring. Then he turned. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to do it properly, and I am aware that I am not practiced at doing things this way, and I would like you to take the quality of the attempt into account." She said, "You have my attention." He came back from the window and stood by the chair, and then, apparently deciding that standing was not right either, sat down again, and then looked at her, with the expression of a man who has a great deal to say, and is trying to find the right order for it. He found it. He said, "I said something at Pembury's ball that I cannot take back. I am not going to try to take it back. I am going to say instead that it was the last thing I said about you that I did not have to immediately correct upon further observation. Every conclusion I have reached since then through actual attention rather than assumption has been different, and more accurate, and more interesting to me than the one before it." She said nothing. She was listening. He continued, "I have found, in the past several months, that I think about you with a frequency and a quality that is unlike anything I have thought about anything else. I find that when I am in a conversation, and I hear something interesting, I think about what you would say to it. I find that the books I selected for the school's library were chosen with more care than I have given to decisions of considerably greater practical consequence, because they were going to you, and that made the precision of them matter in a way I could not entirely explain. I find that the social arrangement, which I proposed as a solution to a specific problem, and have benefited from in exactly the way I said I would, has also produced something I had not accounted for, which is that I am now entirely unable to imagine the resolution of it in the direction of it simply ending." He stopped. She waited. He said, "I am asking you to marry me." The room was very quiet. She looked at him. He sat across from her in the chair with his hands on his knees and his face open in the way it very rarely was. The surface removed, the performance put aside, the actual man in the actual chair, waiting. She said, "Turn around." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "At the window," she said. "You were at the window with your back to me when you were deciding how to say this, and you came back to the chair and said it with your face partly turned away from me, at least twice during what you just said. I want you to say the last part looking at me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" He said it directly, fully facing her, in a voice that had none of the hedging or the searching that the longer speech had contained, just the question, plainly. She felt it land in the room the way true things land when they are said plainly, with a weight that is the opposite of heaviness. "I will give you my answer," she said, "in 3 days." He looked at her. 3 days. Yes. He absorbed this. She watched him resist the impulse to ask why, and watched him decide not to ask it, because he was working on being someone who did not push, and she could see the effort it took, which was part of why she had said 3 days. 3 days, he said, and accepted it. She stood. He stood. They were facing each other across the small space of the library, with the books and the fire and the winter light, and she was aware that the 3 days she had asked for were not really for deciding, because she had decided, but for something else, for giving this the proper weight it deserved, for not letting the momentum of the moment rush her into something she wanted to arrive at deliberately. She offered him her hand. He took it, and held it for a moment the way that he did not do at social events, not the formal gesture of a man observing convention, but a real grip, brief, communicating something that neither of them was yet saying aloud. She left. The 3 days were, in the event, nothing like she expected them to be. She had expected to spend them in the careful, methodical examination of a significant question. She had expected to sit at her desk and work through the thing in the way she worked through all things. Instead, she found herself in a state she had not experienced before, which was the state of already knowing the answer to a question and simply waiting for the correct moment to deliver it. and discovering that this state produces not calm, but a very specific kind of restlessness, the restlessness of a completed thing that has not yet been received. She went to the school both mornings. She saw William's W, which had improved further. She read to the youngest children for an hour on the second morning, seated in the small chair that required her to fold herself into a configuration that Frances would have found comic, with 6 children arranged in a semicircle on the floor in front of her. She ate dinner with her father on the second evening, and he told her a long story about a letter he had received from the Agricultural Society, and she listened to the full length of it with the pleasure of watching someone be happy, and did not think about Ashford House until he had finished. Then he looked at her across the dinner table with his kind eyes and said, "You are different, Alara." "Am I?" she said. "You look like someone who knows something," he said. "You usually look like someone who is finding something out. This is different." She looked at him. "Father." "Yes?" "Would you mind very much," she said, "if things were to change somewhat?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then the warmth in his eyes deepened into something that was not quite surprise, and not quite relief, but was related to both. "My dear," he said, "I have been hoping for exactly that since the summer." She went home and sat by the window in the dark for a long time, and thought about the specific courage required to want something openly, after a long period of wanting things quietly, and about the difference between protecting yourself from disappointment and simply refusing to be available to any of the things that make disappointment possible. On the morning of the third day, she woke up at 7 o'clock and lay in bed for exactly 1 minute, looking at the ceiling. Then she got up, washed, dressed, and wrote a letter. It said, "Yes." Below that she wrote, "Not because of the situation, not because of the arrangement, not because of anything except what I said in your library on Saturday, which I have had 3 days to reconsider and have not reconsidered at all." She sealed it and sent it with the Morning Post before she did anything else, because she had learned a long time ago that the correct thing is best done without the delay of breakfast or habitual hesitation. She went to the school. She taught arithmetic for an hour and read correspondence for another, and helped Mrs. Frost rearrange the older classroom's reading section to accommodate the new books, which had arrived from Ashford House the week before, and were now arranged on the shelves in the order she had specified in her amended list. She was putting the last book in its place when Philip Osborne appeared at the school door. She had not expected him. She stood with the book still in her hand. He handed her a letter. He was extremely correct in his manner and expression, but there was something in his eyes that she recognized as the private satisfaction of someone who is very glad about an outcome and is being professional enough not to say so. She thanked him. He left. She opened the letter. It contained 2 sentences. The first said, "I have read your letter 4 times. The second said, "You previously informed me I was not practiced at this, and I am going to require your ongoing cooperation to improve, which will be a considerable commitment on your part, and I want you to know that I am aware of that." She read it, standing among the new books in the school library, with the winter light coming through the windows, and she laughed, and it was the same laugh she had laughed at the masquerade, the one that caught her by surprise, the one that came from somewhere real. She put the letter in her coat pocket. She finished shelving the books. She went home and wrote him back and told him, in the measured language of a woman who found precision more reliable than flourish, that she had spent most of her adult life being independently sufficient, and that sharing the company of someone whose mind she respected and who had demonstrated, over a considerable period of observation, a capacity for honesty and revision, and the slow, difficult work of seeing things accurately, was not something she experienced as a commitment, but as a very particular kind of good fortune. She did not use the word love, but it was there in the sentence, the way it is there in all sentences that are genuinely about a person, rather than about an idea of them, and she knew he would read it, because he always read what was actually said, rather than only what was safely visible. She was right. His next letter said only, "I know," and she knew that he did. Lord Vane received her letter on a Monday, and made his response on a Tuesday. He had decided, upon reading her 4 sentences, that his position was still strong enough to produce a different outcome if he applied more direct pressure, and so on Tuesday morning, before she had finished her breakfast, he sent a note to 3 specific individuals, whose social reach and appetite for damaging information he had previously identified as useful, enclosing with each note a copy of Gerald Whitmore's original creditor documentation. By Tuesday afternoon, he had received 3 replies, each one informing him, in the various registers of polite bewilderment, that the information appeared to describe a situation that had been resolved some time ago through a private financial arrangement, the details of which were now understood to have been subsumed into the preparations for the forthcoming marriage between Lady Alara Whitmore and the Duke of Ashford. By Tuesday evening, he had heard from 2 more acquaintances who had heard the news by other routes, and who wished to know if he had been aware, and if so, why he had been sending them documents about a situation that was publicly superseded. He did not reply to any of them. He sent no further communications on the subject. He left London 3 days later for his estate in Wiltshire, and was not seen in the city again for the remainder of the season. Alara did not learn the specifics of this until Francis told her on Wednesday morning, having assembled the full picture from several sources with the efficiency that Francis brought to everything she considered worth her full attention. He thought he still had ground to stand on, Francis said. He did not, Alara said. No, the announcement had already reached the 3 people he wrote to before his letters arrived. Edmund moved quickly. Francis looked at her. It was the first time Alara had used his given name in conversation, and neither of them made any remark about it, because Francis was too perceptive to make a remark, and Alara was not going to offer one. The timing was specific, Francis said. Philip Osborne let it be known in the right places on Monday evening, which means the news was already in the correct rooms before Vane could get his letters written and delivered. He anticipated it, Alara said. Yes, Francis said. He knows how Vane operates. He had known him for a long time, apparently. Alara thought about this for a moment, about a man who had prepared the ground before she had even sent her letter, who had moved the pieces into position so that when Vane made his attempt it would land on soil that had already been changed beneath him. He had not told her he was doing it, he had simply done it. She thought about what that meant, and decided it meant exactly what it appeared to mean, that he had been paying attention, and that attention, expressed as action rather than words, was the way he had always been most honest. The engagement was announced formally in December. The response to it was, in the particular social ecosystem of London at that period, considerable. The Duke of Ashford was not a man who had been expected to announce an engagement at all, or at least not any time soon. And the fact of the announcement generated in certain circles the kind of fascinated commentary that very unexpected news generates when the news is also, upon reflection, entirely comprehensible. Mrs. Dorothy Hale, who had witnessed the conversation interrupted at the Harrington dinner, and who had correctly identified it as something worth watching, felt, she told everyone who would listen, entirely vindicated. She had seen it coming, she said, from very early on. Those who had been at Lady Pemberton's masquerade, and had watched a woman in midnight blue and a man in deep burgundy dance 3 dances together with the complete attention of people who had forgotten there was anyone else in the room, recalled this at some length. Several of them, including Lady Pemberton herself, felt that they had been present at the beginning of something, which was accurate, and said so with the satisfaction of people who had been at the right event. Sir Charles Oates, who had chaired the committee at which they had first truly encountered each other, told his wife the whole story over dinner the evening of the announcement, with the authority of someone who had been in the room. His wife told him he had entirely missed what was happening at the time, and was now retrospectively claiming observation. He considered this unfair, but accepted it. Francis did not say anything to anyone who did not already know the story from her, because Francis was loyal in the specific way of people who keep other people's things to themselves until those people have decided what they would like done with them. The ring arrived on a Friday. It was brought to Whitmore House by Philip Osborne, who had been given very specific instructions, including that he was not to simply leave it with the housemaid, but was to wait until Lady Whitmore was available to receive it in person. It was not an extravagant ring. It was an old one, a single deep blue stone in a plain gold setting, the color of a winter midnight, which she recognized as having been chosen specifically, because no one who had paid the kind of attention he had paid for months was going to select something by accident. She held it for a moment before putting it on. Philip Osborne, in the hall, heard nothing, because there was nothing to hear. She was simply standing alone with the ring, and with the knowledge of all the things it stood for. The committee room, and the letters, and the masquerade, and the library by firelight, and the 3 days she had waited to give an answer she had already known. She put it on. She went to the door and told Philip Osborne she was grateful. He said, with perfect correctness, and what might, at the corners of his eyes, have been something warmer. "I will convey your message, Lady Whitmore." She went back to her desk and sat for a while. She looked at the wooden box. She opened it. The donation letter, the 61 names, the 3 sentences, the 4-page book list with her annotations in the margins, and the letter that said, "I have read your letter 3 times before responding." She looked at all of it. She took the box and placed it in the larger drawer of the desk, where she kept the things she intended to keep permanently. Then she picked up her pen and began to write a letter to the school board, because the school's spring term was 6 weeks away, and there were materials to order, and a roof tile to replace, and a proposal she had been drafting for 6 months for a second classroom, that she believed they now had the funding to consider properly. She wrote for an hour, with the ring on her hand, and the winter afternoon shortening outside the window, and when she finished, she was satisfied with the letter, and she set it aside to be posted in the morning. Then she allowed herself, for the space of a single quiet moment, to feel the full width of what had happened. She was going to marry Edmund Hartwell. She was going to marry a man who had been wrong about her in public and right about her in private, and honest about both. She was going to marry someone whose mind interested her, and whose company she had come to require in the specific way you require something that has become part of how you think. Not an addition to the life you already have, but a change in the way the life functions. She was going to keep the school. He had not asked her not to. He had put both their names on the deed, the way he had always done things he considered to be simply the correct way to do them, quietly and without announcement, so that the fact of it was simply true before anyone had had time to discuss whether it should be. She was going to continue to be exactly who she was. This had always been the thing she had been most careful about, the thing she had guarded with the most energy, and at the most personal cost. The fear that the version of herself she had built was incompatible with the version of a life that included someone else at its center. She knew now that this fear had been a useful one, in the years when it had protected her from the wrong things, and that it had outlived its usefulness some months ago, without her quite noticing. She had noticed now. Spring arrived on a Saturday in early April with the particular theatrical confidence of a season that has been anticipated for long enough that its actual arrival is slightly startling. The trees in the square outside Whitmore House came into blossom overnight, or seemed to, and the quality of the light changed in the way that spring light changes, becoming wider and less apologetic, filling the rooms with something that winter had not supplied. The wedding was on a Wednesday. She wore white with no ornamentation except the ring, which was already on her hand and which she saw no reason to remove for the purposes of a ceremony. The church was full of the people who belonged in this story. Frances in green, who managed to look delighted and composed simultaneously, which was one of her particular gifts. Gerald Whitmore, who had not looked this well in years, and who cried quietly, during the vows, in the dignified way of a man who has not prepared himself for his own emotion, and is accepting it with grace. Lady Agnes Hartwell, Edmund's grandmother, who was 91 years old and had attended a great many weddings, and had a formidably critical eye, and who sat in the front pew and looked at Alara with the expression of someone revising an opinion in real time, which was the highest compliment she had offered anyone in living memory. Philip Osborne was there. He looked, for the full duration of the service, exactly like someone who was very pleased and had no intention of admitting it. Edmund stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered to him, completely, without performance, without the divided quality that attention often has when it is being watched. She walked toward him with the same quality of attention she gave everything she had decided to do, deliberately, knowing exactly where she was going and why. They said the words that needed to be said. He put the ring on, and it sat beside the blue stone, and the two of them together looked exactly right, which she had not expected to think, and which she thought anyway. At the reception, held at Ashford House for the first time in many years, the rooms were full of the particular warmth of an event that is genuinely celebratory, rather than merely social. People ate and spoke, and moved through the large rooms that Alara was now beginning to think of as also hers. which was a strange and not unpleasant sensation. She was standing with Lady Agnes and Mrs. Dorothy Hale and two other women she knew well when she heard Edmund's voice from the adjacent room. She could not see him, she could hear him, because the rooms at Ashford House communicated in a way that meant voices carried further than they appeared to. He was speaking to an elderly lord named Sir Philip Clary, who was old enough to have been at every social event for the past 40 years, and who kept the details of all of them in the kind of meticulous social memory that some people develop to compensate for having nothing more interesting to think about. Sir Philip Clary said, in a voice that carried with the cheerful confidence of someone who considers himself amusing, "Ashford, didn't you say, at Pembury's ball, 'God help the man who weds her'? I believe I was standing not 10 feet from you when you said it." The room adjacent was quiet for a moment. Lady Agnes, beside Alara, looked at her. Alara looked at the space between the two rooms and waited. She heard Edmund's voice say, with the particular quality of someone who has considered the question and found the true answer, and is content to give it, "Yes. I said it." Another moment. And then, "And he has." Sir Philip Clary made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. The sound of a man who has received an answer that is both perfect and slightly beyond what he expected. Lady Agnes looked at Alara with the sharp eyes of someone who has been alive long enough to know the difference between the things people say and the things they mean. "Well," she said, in the dry tone she kept in reserve for the moments she was genuinely moved, "at least he learned something." Alara said, "He learns quickly when he decides to pay attention." He did not always decide to pay attention. "No," she agreed, "but when he did, he paid it fully." Lady Agnes considered this. "You," she said, "are going to be good for him." "I know," Alara said. "And is he going to be good for you?" She looked across the rooms to where she could see him now, standing with Sir Philip Clary and two other men, and he glanced up at that moment, with the precision of a man who always knew where she was in a room, and met her eyes. "Yes," she said, "he is." She raised her glass. In the other room, he raised his. Outside, the April light fell across the garden of Ashford House in the wide and unhurried way of spring light, touching the early blossoms on the trees that bordered the wall, the same trees that had been bare and orderly and patient all winter, waiting, the way patient things wait, for the season to change. The ring on her hand was the color of midnight in winter. On the other side of the wall, the city moved in its indifferent way, full of its thousands of stories, each one proceeding at its own pace, toward its own particular ending. Somewhere in Whitechapel, a school with 61 children and a growing library was preparing for the spring term. A 7-year-old named William was, in all probability, practicing the letter W, with the serious determination of someone who has made a decision about a thing and intends to be excellent at it. In the garden, the blossom moved. In the room, the people ate and drank and spoke, and two of them, on opposite sides of a door, had a conversation with their eyes that required no words and needed none, because some things are said most clearly in the silence between people who have spent enough time learning to read each other that the reading has become a kind of fluency, available without effort, present without announcement. By spring, she was wearing his ring, and the man who had said, "God help the man who weds her," stood in his own house on the first warm day of April, and knew, with the precision of someone who has spent enough time correcting his own mistakes to recognize what correctness feels like, that he had been helped. More completely than he had known how to ask, more precisely than he had deserved, more generously than he had, in that first terrible careless moment at a winter ball 2 years ago, given any reason to expect. There is a particular quality to the silence of a house in the early morning, before anyone else has woken, and Edmund Hartwell had known it intimately for most of his adult life. He woke at 5:30, most mornings, by a habit that had formed so long ago he could no longer remember choosing it, and he lay in the silence of Ashford House for a few minutes, before rising, listening to the city beyond the windows beginning its day, in the gradual and indifferent way that cities begin days. A cartwheel, a voice in the street, the distant sound of a church clock measuring the early hour. He had lived in this house for 23 years. He had been born in the country, and brought here at 9 years old, when his father died, and the title descended, and the weight of everything that came with it settled onto the household, in the particular way of things that cannot be anticipated until they are actual. He had not resented the wait. It was simply his life, and he was not a person who spent much time resenting the shape of things he could not change. What he had resented, quietly, without ever naming it in those terms, was the loneliness that the wait produced, the specific isolation of a position that placed you at the center of every room, while keeping you at a remove from every genuine conversation. He had managed it. He had managed it so well, and for so long, that he had stopped noticing it was management. It had become simply how he operated, and the people who occupied his daily life, the staff at Ashford House, the colleagues on various committees, the acquaintances at his club and at society events, had long since accepted that this was the nature of him, contained, precise, not given to displays of feeling or expressions of uncertainty. He thought about this on the morning after Alara had left Ashford House on Thursday, lying in the early dark with the city beginning outside the windows. He had said more to her in that library than he had said to anyone in years. More accurately, he had said more true things, and the experience of saying true things about himself to a person who received them without flinching and responded with true things in return was, he found, quite unlike anything he had expected. He was 40 years old. He had been telling himself for a considerable time that the quiet of his life was contentment. He had been close enough to contentment that the distinction had not been urgently obvious. He could see the distinction now. Contentment does not leave you lying awake at 5:30, thinking about a conversation with such clarity that the words come back to you in exactly the order they were said. He got up. He went to the library, which was still faintly warm from the previous evening's fire. He sat in the chair where she had sat and thought about everything that had been said and everything that had not been said, and about the word both, which she had used with the specificity of someone who meant something precise by it. He had read enough of her letters by then to know how she used language. She did not include words for effect. Every word was load-bearing. Both. He thought about what both meant in her precise vocabulary, applied to a question about whether she had come to him for a practical reason. He thought about it until the fire was entirely cold, and Philip appeared at the door with the kind of tact that Philip had always had, offering coffee without commentary, and asking no questions about why the Duke had been sitting in the library since before 6 in the morning. "The announcement," Edmund said, and Philip looked at him. "Your Grace? I want it made in the right places before the end of Monday, before Vane moves, if he moves." Philip looked at him with the careful expression of someone who has worked closely with a person for long enough to follow a conversation that has not included all of its steps. "Lady Whitmore has not yet." "No," Edmund said, "she has not. And I am not making an announcement about her position. I am making one about mine. I intend to ask her to marry me. That is my position. That can be known without requiring her answer to already be given." Philip absorbed this. "She will likely answer," he said carefully, "within 3 days." Edmund looked at him. "Yes," he said, "I hope so. But in the meantime, the announcement of my intention changes the ground under Vane's position, whether or not the answer has arrived." Philip was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And if she says no?" Edmund looked at the cold fireplace. "Then the ground will shift back," he said, "and that will be the appropriate consequence of the situation, and I will have to manage it." He said it without drama, because he had thought about it enough to have moved past drama and into the flat territory of realistic possibility. "But she will not say no," Philip said, in the tone of someone stating an observation, rather than offering encouragement, which was the only kind of thing Philip ever said. Edmund looked at him. "How would you know?" "She has been corresponding with you," Philip said, "with the frequency and quality of attention that a person applies to something they consider important. The book list, the letters, the 3 days she asked for, which is the behavior of a person who already knows the answer, and is ensuring they arrive at it correctly, rather than quickly." He paused. "I have been handling your correspondence for 14 years, Your Grace. I know what it looks like when something matters." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Send the announcement to the relevant people before Monday evening," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." Philip left. Edmund sat in the cold library with his coffee, and the particular quality of attention he gave things that mattered to him, which was total and unhurried, and had taken him, over the past several months, in a direction he had not expected, and could not now imagine reversing. He thought about a woman who arrived at a committee meeting with 61 children's names written in a hand-drawn ledger because she believed that unnamed things were uncared-for things. He thought about a woman who danced with the ease of someone who had stopped performing for the room. He thought about a woman who sat in his library with the unguarded intelligence of someone who had decided, at some point in the conversation, that maintaining a safe distance was costing her more than it was protecting her. He thought about both. He finished his coffee. He went to the writing desk in the corner of the library and took out a sheet of paper and began, not for the first time, to try to write something true, in a way that was also sufficient. He had been trying since the masquerade. He had sent things that were true and had not been sufficient. He had sent things that were almost sufficient, and had worried, upon rereading, that they were not quite true. The letter with 3 sentences had been the closest he had come. I have read your letter 3 times. I said something that was unkind and unearned. I am sorry. He looked at the blank paper now. He needed something that was not another letter. He had written enough letters. What he needed was a room and a fire, and the nerve to say plainly, without the editorial distance that letters permitted, the thing he had been working toward for months. He put the pen down. He had the room. He had the fire. He was going to have to find the nerve. He looked at the bare winter garden through the library window and decided that the nerve was already there, had been there since a Thursday evening in a committee room, when a woman had placed 61 names on a table, and he had known, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that he was in the presence of someone he had entirely failed to see correctly. It had taken him some time to admit this. He was admitting it now. He thought about what it meant to live your whole life doing things correctly, and doing almost none of them truly, to maintain the shape of everything at the cost of the substance of it. He thought about a woman who had never maintained shapes she didn't mean. He thought about what it would be like to live alongside that quality, to have it in the same house, at the same table, in the chair across the fire. He thought it would be the most honest thing his life had contained in a very long time. He went upstairs to dress for the day. He was going to ask her properly, on Saturday, in a way that was both accurate and sufficient. He was going to get it right. He had had a great deal of practice getting things wrong, and the main thing he had learned from that practice was that the correct thing, when you finally say it, is always simpler than you expected. You say it because it is true. And then you say it again, if asked, facing forward. And then you wait. The way that things wait, which have put down the habit of pretending patience, is the same as indifference, and which have learned, at last, the difference between the two. He waited. And on Saturday she came. And the garden behind Ashford House, bare and orderly in December, waited too, in its patient and botanical way, for the season that was coming, for the April light, for the blossoms that were already forming, slowly and without announcement, in the hard wood of the branches, for the spring, which always came, which was, in the end, exactly what it had always been, not a sudden arrival, but the completion of a long, quiet, necessary process that had been happening long before anyone was ready to look out the window and notice.